Hello Traceable Designers. Today we're making an adjustment to the swag side panel design form length. We're adding 10 inches. We're also keeping a 6-inch rod pocket section for a header or a gathered header. If you are planning to add pleats to your side panel, make sure that you add the pleats first, then follow the pleated side panel rod pocket instructions. When sizing your fabric section, remember we're adding 10 inches to this 28.5 inch long form, plus we're adding 6 inches for the rod pocket section. Make sure you have a very straight edge across your fabric and plenty of room for both width and length before you begin. We will be measuring down for the rod pocket section first. So you're going to have a straight edge across the top of your fabric. Make sure that's perfectly straight and measure down across the entire width of your fabric for the 6 inches. So just continue along marking and then trace the top of the design form to connect those marks. To measure the panel length, you'll measure from the 6-inch mark. So that is below the rod pocket area, down 38 inches. That is the length of the panel. So you'll mark the fabric along the side and then position your design form at the 38-inch marker to begin tracing. Begin by tracing the lower section, so you'll make sure you can really see that line. So trace along the bottom and across the curved area. Then we're going to trace up the slanted side and start moving the valance design form up in the direction of the rod pocket line. So we want to slide the design form up to the rod pocket line, and then we'll continue tracing up the slanted side until we get to the straight lower edge. This is going to make a wider panel, and it's also going to be an even angle all the way up. Then trace the under section, that is the depth of the upper part of the valance, and then we'll just measure across the full width. So depending upon how much width you need for your valance panel to cover your window, that will be determined by the amount of space on the upper section. I'm using the full 45-inch wide panel for mine, so I'm not tracing the right side of the design form to trace off my width. Then just use the top of the design form to straighten that line out. Then just follow the trace line all the way along until you've cut out your valance panel. Do not cut the rod pocket section. We're going to fold that over because we're going to do our lining. So you want to make sure that folds over 6 inches because we're adjusting that panel for sizing our lining. Then just run an iron across that. Cut a section of lining that's very straight across the top, and then position your panel with the folded rod pocket section on top of your lining. You want to make sure you have plenty of excess lining around the edges, so you'll want to trace probably at least 3 inches of excess all the way around the shape of your valance. Make sure you keep that positioned properly, because when this lining goes on, you need it to completely cover your base panel and all of the glue. So we're using the Alter Hold seam tape. We're measuring down for the rod pocket. You do not want to use the seam tape on the rod pocket section. So on the short and the long side, measure down your 6 inches. Position your seam tape along the edge. Don't overlap onto your ironing board. Then just iron following the shape of your panel using the seam tape. So you'll cut sections of that, you'll tear that off, and then you'll continue around. When you get to the lower section where there's a curve, you'll do this in pieces. So just position your seam tape overlapped, and then you'll just cut pieces so that you follow that curve. You want to get that as curved as you possibly can, and it's pretty simple using the pieces of seam tape. So just take your time following around the entire shape of the panel. You can see where the fabric is cut just a little uneven in some of the areas. The seam tape does just straighten that right out, because when you add your lining and then you reverse the panel, you have a very straight edge. So when you get up to the top to the straight part of the valance, you'll just cut that, overlap the seam tape, and continue around until you get to the short side on the upper section. You want to make sure you are only putting the seam tape below the rod pocket section, so cut a piece off for that so you make sure you don't overlap. Once the seam tape has completely cooled, just peel it off, and then we can add the lining. So position your lining over your fabric aligned across your 6-inch rod pocket mark. So you'll make sure that you overlap the lining around all of the edges and then just pin that to hold it. You can move that as needed, but we want to make sure that the lining is overlapping over all of the glue. Start with a sweeping motion in the center, sweeping down and out. The whole idea is you don't want your lining to buckle. So by moving the iron from the top of the rod pocket section out toward the seam tape, you can get a nice flat lining, and then you'll run your iron along the seam tape to secure it around the edges. So this keeps the buckling from happening, and as you can see, we have a nice large piece of lining. In case this does shift, you want to continue to push the lining out, and you want to make sure all the glue is covered. When you get to the short end, if you have to make some adjustments and move the pins, you can, but just make sure you get as close to the rod pocket as possible. Then just follow along to remove all the excess lining from the edges. Make sure your seams are completely cool, and then we're going to reverse this fabric. So we're going to cut a couple of little V snips in the corners and around the curved bottom and all of the edges. This is going to make the fabric turn easily. You don't want to overcut so that you cut past your glue or you will have a hole in your valance, so make sure you're very careful with that. Then just take your time reversing the panel, pushing your fingers out into the corners and get a really nice shape. Then you're going to just carefully shape your panel with the iron. So you'll keep adjusting it and ironing along the lining side. You'll just move along until that's completely flattened. You can keep pushing out the corners as needed in order to flatten that out. Then just do sort of a double check. You might need to pull on the fabric a little bit carefully there until you've gotten that all flattened out. You've got one little curved area where the straight section starts on the top, so you can pull your fabric a little bit and iron that down, and that will smooth out to a nice curved section on top. So once you've gotten everything flattened down, then we're going to proceed with fusing the lining in place. We want to make sure that this lining does not hang from the back and show. So we're going to secure everything. So cut a piece of seam tape for the outside edges. So you want to make sure that's hidden completely behind the fold, so you can just fuse that down. Then once the tape has completely cooled, remove that and seal your edges. Then we're going to start sweeping the lining forward and up. You want to pull all that up so that that is as secure as possible, that it's not hanging down below. And then we're going to insert sections of seam tape. You can have that about 1/4 inch below the lining. You just don't want it to have the glue exposed above the lining, or it'll make your rod pocket not close properly. So just make sure you follow the entire length and then run the iron underneath. I usually use the iron on top to get it secured a little bit at first, and then lift the lining and finish securing the seam tape. Then just remove all of the tape, and then again sweep everything up before you actually seal the lining. Then just run your iron across that strip so that you've sealed your lining completely, and you'll have a really clean, nice panel. Now we're going to make the rod pocket. So we want to finish the top section. We want that to be a nice clean edge. So put a strip of the fusible backing across the top, remove that, and then fold that over to create a clean seam. So now we'll start to attach our fusible backing to create the rod pocket with the header. So run a strip of fusible backing across the top edge of your lining and then across the folded section on the top edge of your panel. And then we're going to make the rod pocket area. So this is important. We need a 1-inch pocket so that it grabs the fabric and makes a nice gather. So measure down 1 1/8 inches from the bottom edge of the seam tape that is running across your lining. You need 1 1/8 inches to fit your rod, but also be tight enough to grab a nice gather. So you'll measure across the entire fabric section on the lining, and then we're going to position another strip of seam tape that falls just across those marks and below. This will create a 1 1/8 inch rod pocket section. So fuse that down all the way across, wait for the seam tape to cool completely and peel that off, and then we're going to fold that rod pocket section over to cover the exposed glue. So just fold that evenly across the glue section, the exposed glue, and then we're going to iron the entire pocket down across the glue strips. So make sure your corners or your edges are really secured. Run your iron across there, and make sure before you insert your rod into the rod pocket that it is fully cooled. So you can see we have our rod pocket and we have the header, and the rod pocket is nice and tight, and we can get a nice gather for our header. To do your left side panel, you'll use the design form in the reverse position. Follow all the same steps, just using the design form in the reversed position. And you'll be ready to hang your beautiful gathered swag valance. Thank you for joining me, Traceable Designers, and remember, you can always make your mark with Traceable Designer.